is faith? If I were to ask an unchurched person what faith is, they might say, oh, it's some sort of religious word. If I ask Christians what faith is, they'll probably say it's belief. Specifically, belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he was crucified and raised to new life. And that's true. Except we have to be careful because sometimes these words that we use mean different things to different people. To us, belief is about assenting to an idea, to say that I think that that is true. But to the ancient audience, they understood belief differently. Belief was trust. Trust in an idea would necessitate action. You couldn't be said to believe something if you didn't act in accordance with it. And so when we talk about faith that saves, we also need to talk about the faith that transforms. The Apostle John in 1 John 5, 1-4 talks about the way that faith transforms our lives. It says, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the Father also loves the one born of him. And this is how we know that we love God's children, when we love God and obey his commands. For this is what love for God is, to keep his commands. And his commands are not a burden, because everyone who has been born of God conquers the world. This is the victory that conquered the world, our faith. Today, I want to look at faith's victory over the world. Now, for some people, faith is merely an identifier of who's on the inside and who's on the outside. It doesn't go any deeper than that. It's no more important than who is a Canadians fan versus who is a Leafs fan. If I were to ask such people, how does your faith change your life? How can you prove your faith through action? They would say, whoa, let's not be legalistic. I'm saved by grace through faith. And so it's not my works that save me, so if I try to work at being good, then I'm trying to earn my salvation. No, I need to just do what I want and allow God's grace to cover over my sin. And if God wants me to change, then God can change the inclinations of my heart away from sin towards righteousness. So I'll just keep doing as I please and trust that God's got the rest. Well, that is not consistent with the message that Scripture that says this is a distortion of the gospel. As James tells us, faith without works is dead. So John says that God's children are those who believe, and by believe he means to trust, that Jesus is the Christ. In other words, the King. So do we see a king when we look at Jesus? If I was a bystander on Mount Calvary on Good Friday, what would I see? I might see a Galilean peasant being brutalized by the political and military might of Rome. That's what my natural eyes would see. But if I have faith in my heart, I see a deeper reality beneath the surface. I understand that in that Galilean peasant agonizing on that cross, I'm also seeing God's Son enthroned, reconciling the world to himself and overcoming sin and death. This is an understanding that I can only have through faith. So I believe that Jesus is the King who has overcome sin and death. If I believe that Jesus is the King who has overcome sin and death, I likely look at the world around me and wonder why I still see so much sin and death in the world. Some people give voice to this concern. Other people avoid giving voice to it because it feels like disloyalty. But it's not disloyal to say this. Instead, I think it's the engagement of our faith. Because this victory of Jesus on the cross, God has done everything that he needs to do, but it is not yet a complete victory. Because it still needs to work itself out into the world. And when we understand that the world is not as it should be, our natural response should be to come to the God who raises the dead and say, what you did there, do here and do it now. And so our faith should lead us into prayer, this conversation with God by which we invite him into our present circumstances. We join with Jesus in praying, "Let your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Prayer is our expression of the conviction that God can do so much more than we see around us. And so, when we, for example, see a situation that's unfortunate, maybe I have a neighbor who struggles with drug addiction. And of course, that addiction itself is enough of a problem, but it also has knock-on effects to the families and the communities around. And I see this, I can lament. And lamenting is probably an appropriate response. But I lament differently because I have faith in God who has overcome sin and death. And so I believe that the God who raises the dead can raise the literal dead can also raise the figurative dead, that he can breathe life into the situation of death. And so I am moved to pray, "Lord, have mercy in this situation." In prayer, we invite God to work in the situations around us. And God works with us, doing what we cannot, but still involving us. And so our prayer inevitably leads us into mission. After all, God could have evangelized Cyprus and Asia Minor and Greece on his own, but he chooses to use the Apostle Paul. We also see this in the life of Jesus. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he has this, I don't know if it's one day, of amazing preaching and healing and exorcising demons and everything. And you think, oh man, that Jesus would be exhausted after that, so he's going to be wiped out and he's going to probably get up the next day at noon. But then we read this in Mark 1:35-38. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he got up, went out, made his way to a deserted place, and there he was praying. Simon and his companions searched for him, and when they found him, they said, "Everyone's looking for you." And he said to them, "Let's go to the neighboring villages so that I may preach there too. This is why I have come." So Jesus treats prayer as a priority. Obviously, he's getting up at, say, 5 in the morning to go and pray after a long day. But prayer serves as a launching pad for more mission. And so prayer must lead us beyond itself into mission. Now, you might ask yourself, why do we have to pray? Why not just move from the place of faith to the place of mission? Well, the reason is that prayer weds human will to divine power. And the size of the task that we've been given, to go and make disciples of all nations, to involve ourselves in actualizing the reconciliation of all things to God, that's just too big a task for us to do with the strength, the skills, and the resources that we have at our own disposal. But the Spirit of God that comes to us in prayer is a force multiplier that allows us to effectively work for God. Now, I need to define a term here. I used the word mission. When I was a kid, we talked a lot about missions. We always used it in the plural, and by that we meant overseas evangelism. And evangelism's great, but the problem with missions is that it's something that only a few people can be directly involved with. I was actually a missionary, so I was the guy at the tip of the spear, but there's always far more behind because it takes a lot of money for a person to go live in another country. And so you can have a few missionaries and a whole lot of people that can just make financial contributions or pray for them, but are not directly involved in the mission themselves. When I talk about mission in the singular, I'm talking about the realization that God is at work redeeming the world. And the idea that the church then is invited by God to participate with him in the work that he's already doing. And so mission is anything that we do that is a participation in God's redeeming and restoring work. Mission can mean shoveling my neighbor's driveway because they're injured. Mission can be preparing food for the market meal so that we can show the community that we believe that God has blessed us with an abundance, and so we want to bless the community with an abundance. It's not something that only the elite few can do. It's something that we can all and should all engage in. So our faith leads us into prayer. Our prayer becomes the launching pad of mission. And mission leads to the transformation of people. Paul went and preached the good news of Jesus to the Ephesians. And there were many pagan Ephesians who lived in the power of the occult. And when they saw this good news, or they heard this good news about Jesus, they abandoned their old way of life and became Christians. They made such a decisive break with their old way of being that they actually burned all the books that they had for their occultic spells or incantations or whatever it is that they would do. And Paul, writing to the Ephesians, talks about the transformation, where we are taken from dead and made alive. In Ephesians 2, we read this: "You were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you previously walked according to the ways of the world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit now at work in the disobedient. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love that he had for us, made us alive with Christ, even though we were dead in trespasses." So Jesus destroys the power of sin on the cross, but God's mission is a partnership with us that takes that victory on the cross and turns it into a reality in the communities where we are located. So faith leads us to prayer, which leads us to mission, which leads us to transformation, and transformed people bear witness to God. How many of us have come to faith because we saw the transformation of another person, and that was a witness to us that Jesus really is the King? We can try and argue people into the kingdom of heaven making logical arguments. They're often not very persuasive. I think that the stories of what God has done, the transformed lives, are a far greater evidence of Jesus' kingship than any logical argument that I can make. We see an example of this in the scriptures. In John chapter 4, Jesus meets a woman at a well. She's a Samaritan woman that's been married 5 times. And the fact that she's at the well in the middle of the day when it's hottest, when nobody would want to be there, shows that these marriages have resulted in her exclusion from the community. She wants to disengage from this community. Maybe the people would make fun of her if she came at the same time. And so she's very detached. And she gets in a conversation with Jesus. And eventually Jesus has a way of making her understand that he knows what she's done wrong, but at the same time, he still accepts her anyways. This realization is transforming for her. And she runs to get all of the people in the village. This woman who's been avoiding everybody is suddenly going out to try to talk to everybody. This absolute transformation of who she is, it means that people are curious and they all come to Jesus. And then what happens when those people come to Jesus? Well, they believe as well. And so the witness of this woman begets faith. And so we've closed the circle. We've created a virtuous cycle of faith and prayer and mission and transformation and witness, which leads to faith in others, which will lead to prayer, etc. And we'll keep going around and around the cycle. And so the faith that this person has borne fruit in producing more faith in others to follow after them. So faith produces greater faith, but faith also produces greater love. When we understand God's love for us, we can't help but respond with our own love. That's how love works. Just this past summer, I went to a play at the Stratford Festival of Much Ado About Nothing. And I'd read the play in high school, but it had been over 30 years since I'd seen it. And so when we watched it, I was reminded of how it works. So there's this guy, Benedict, and this girl, Beatrice, and they're both very proud and very smart, and they get into this sort of verbal sparring match every time they're around one another. And so they're the kind of people that you would think are the least likely to end up together, but their friends decide to play a trick on them. Benedict's friends start talking about how Beatrice is secretly in love with him when he's in earshot, but they act as if they don't realize that he's there. And on the other side, Beatrice's friends act as if, or they pretend that Benedict is secretly in love with her, and they have this conversation while she's like hidden else in the room. And so when Beatrice believes that Benedict loves her, and Benedict believes that Beatrice loves her, they actually fall in love because they respond to that sense that they are loved, and love calls forth greater love. Now, in this case, it's kind of under false pretenses. But how much more do we respond to God's love if by faith we see what God has done for us on the cross, how he has poured himself out for us even though we were still his enemies? And if we truly comprehend that by faith, then we will have no choice but to love God, because his love for us calls forth our love. As was said, we love because he first loved us. But love for God also entails love for his children. Fatima was widowed at a young age with 2 children. And after she grieved her husband, she decided that she needed to go out into the market and look for a new companion. And so she looked far and wide until she encountered Greg. She and Greg get along great. Greg's funny. He likes some of the same stuff that she does. They enjoy just sitting there and talking to one another. And they have a common sense of humor, and everything feels like it's clicking. And one day, Greg gets down on one knee and he says, "Fatima, I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. But just you. Can we send the kids off to an orphanage so that we can just get married and build a life together?" Now, if Fatima is the kind of mother that almost any mother would be, she's probably not going to agree to this arrangement. Because Greg needs to learn that to love her means to love her children as well. And so it is with us. To love God, we must also love God's children, the church. And so we do this, how? By obeying God's commands. Now this might seem a little counterintuitive. Obedience, that feels like a dirty word in our culture. Somebody's telling me what to do. That doesn't feel like it's compatible with love. Let me tell you, the commands that God gives us aren't about God dominating us. If God were into dominating us, then Jesus would probably come as the iron-fisted ruler that many Jews expected the Messiah to be. But in Jesus, we see that God is loving, that God wants to persuade us. He wants to woo us into a relationship with him, not hold a gun to our head to force us into a relationship with him. So when God gives us commands, those commands are not for God's sake. They are for the sake of his children whom he loves. So God tells you not to do certain things to me because that would hurt me and he loves me. And God tells me not to do certain things to you because that would hurt you and he loves you. And so the rules that we have aren't about God feeling powerful. They are about creating an environment in which everyone can flourish, in which everyone can belong. So love for God and love for people are inseparably linked. As Paul puts it, the commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and any other commandment are summed up by this commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfillment of the law. So, faith leads to greater faith and greater love. And this is the shape of the victory that overcomes the world. By faith in what God has done through Jesus, God's people live a new life. A life of prayer, mission, transformation, witness, and love. And by the power of God, these things can make the world new.